I think Republicans are also gambling on the fact that in this environment and given their reputation, they're likely to benefit more from such corporate expenditures, and they don't want to do anything to diminish it.
This is At Brookings, a weekly in-depth look at the issues behind the news. This week, campaign finance reform.
Earlier this year, the Supreme Court decided that corporations, unions, and people with deep pockets could dole out unlimited funds on campaign ads. The ruling has congressional Democrats devising ways to blunt its impact. They've proposed legislation that would force advertisers to disclose how much they're spending to influence elections. And the bill would also prohibit ads by foreign-owned firms. But the GOP is generally opposed. Governance Studies senior fellow Thomas Mann examines this thorny issue. Tom, congressional Democrats recently introduced legislation to sort of mitigate the effects of the Supreme Court decision that came down in January, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. What exactly does this mean?
It was a striking political gesture, in effect adding the Congress to the president in criticizing the Supreme Court for its decision in Citizens United and pledging to pursue a legislative course that would, to some extent, mitigate the potential effects of the decision. They can't reverse it. It was a constitutional decision, but they have worked in the weeks and months since that decision to figure out a way to try to limit its impact.
Explain what the Supreme Court decision actually does.
We have had on our books in statutes since 1907 restrictions on what corporations can do with regard to participation in political campaigns and federal elections. This court, the Roberts Court, overturned that decision and said, indeed, the First Amendment applies to corporations as well as to individuals, and they have every right to spend money from their treasuries for independent political campaigns.
How does the congressional legislation seek to temper or mitigate some of the effects of the Supreme Court decision?
It calls for CEOs of companies to stand by their ad, to actually appear at the end of such advertisements, as politicians now do, and take responsibility for it. It also requires a more fulsome disclosure regime so that information is reported to the Federal Elections Commission about which companies spent how much money for what purpose, both directly themselves or through third-party organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce. That is the thrust of the legislation. They also try to limit the number of corporations that would have this right. For example, if a company is substantially foreign-owned, they'd be prohibited. If they had received financial bailout, TARP funds, they would be prohibited. If they are major government contractors, they would be prohibited.
This is an election year. How can Republicans support something that the public is so stridently against?
In past days, prominent Republicans like Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell have said we're against regulations but not against disclosure. In fact, we believe disclosure can cleanse that whole process, and we can take restrictions off contributions, expenditures, and the rest. But now they've changed their tune. Those pursuing deregulation of campaign finance have now decided anonymous contributions have some virtue and should be protected by the First Amendment. I think Republicans are also gambling on the fact that in this environment and given their reputation, they're likely to benefit more from such corporate expenditures, and they don't want to do anything to diminish it.
Tom, I think you could make the argument that in allowing big businesses and unions to funnel huge amounts of money into campaign advertising, you take the voice away from smaller donors. Is that a fair assessment?
One of the most promising public policy approaches is to leverage public funding as matches, multiple matches for very small donations, giving candidates the incentive to go out and raise money from these small donors, as well as the individuals themselves seeing, gee, if I give $50, another 200 or so might come to the candidate as a match in public financing. So I think the way to try to level the playing field is best pursued by building up from the bottom rather than trying to restrict on the top, because the court has spoken clearly.
Tom, thank you so much for your time here today.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again next week. I'm Gigi Hinton.
At Brookings is produced by the Brookings Institution. To learn more about the issues discussed on At Brookings, visit our website at brookings.edu.